The shovel blade was a dull silver tongue, tasting the baked earth of August. It sliced down, met resistance, and with a grunt from Alara, surrendered a wedge of dry soil and brittle roots. She tossed it to the side, the dust hanging in the motionless air like a held breath. The sun was a hammer at the top of the sky, relentless. Sweat traced clean paths through the grime on her neck and forehead. Beside the porch, in the sliver of shade cast by the cabin's overhang, her old dog Boro lay with his chin on his paws, his amber eyes following her every move. He did not pant. He was too old and too wise to waste the energy. He simply watched, his breathing a slow, patient rhythm against the percussive scrape and thud of the shovel. This was the 43rd day of digging. The trench snaked away from her, a raw, uncompromising scar across the hard-packed yard. It began near the wellhead, curved past the corner of the small barn, and aimed for the foundation of the cabin itself. It was 3 feet deep and 2 feet wide. It was the craziest thing anyone in the valley had ever seen. The sound of hoofbeats made Boro lift his head, a low rumble starting in his chest. Alara paused, leaning on the shovel's worn handle, and squinted toward the dirt track that served as a road. Silas Blackwood sat atop his gray gelding, his figure a dark silhouette against the bleached sky. He ran a herd of 200 cattle on the adjoining land, a man whose opinions were as hard and unyielding as the winter ground. He reined in his horse, the leather creaking in the profound silence. "Still at it, girl?" His voice was rough, but not entirely unkind. It was the voice of a man stating an obvious, unfortunate fact. Alara nodded, not wasting words. She took a sip of water from the tin canteen hanging from a porch post. It was warm. Blackwood shifted in his saddle. "August's sun is for curing hay, not digging holes to nowhere. What in God's name are you trying to accomplish?" He gestured with a gloved hand at the meandering ditch. "Looks like a giant snake got lost and died in your yard." "It's a plan," Alara said. Her voice was quiet, rusty from disuse. "A plan for what? To break your back before the first frost?" He shook his head, a gesture of pity that grated more than any insult. "Your father, he was a good man, a practical man. He'd be telling you to put down that shovel and get your wood stacked. Winter's coming." "I know," she said. She turned back to her work, driving the shovel blade into the earth again. The conversation was over. Blackwood watched her for another minute, the silence stretching between them. He saw the stubborn set of her shoulders, the methodical, unhurried pace of her labor. He saw a grief-stricken orphan digging her own sorrow into the land. "You wait until winter," he said, more to his horse than to her. "That ditch will be a trench of ice and mud. You'll be lucky if you don't break a leg falling into your own foolishness." He clicked his tongue and rode on, leaving a trail of dust to settle in his wake. Boro let out a soft huff, the rumble in his chest subsiding. He laid his head back down. He trusted the shovel. He trusted the girl. That evening, with the sun bleeding orange and purple behind the western peaks, Alara sat at the simple pine table her father had built. The cabin was one room, clean and spare. By the light of a kerosene lamp, she had her grandfather's journal open. It was a thick, leather-bound book, its pages filled with a spidery, precise script and intricate diagrams drawn in faded ink. Her grandfather had not been a rancher. He had been a university man, an engineer who had studied old ways, forgotten physics, the simple, powerful truths of the natural world. He'd retired to this valley, a place he called a perfect laboratory for his theories. Her finger traced a drawing of a homestead much like her own. A network of channels, just like the one she was digging, connected the buildings. He called it a hypocaust, an old Roman word. But his design was different, adapted for the high plains. He wrote of thermal mass, of the Earth's deep, constant temperature, a steady 55 degrees even when the air above was 30 below. The ground itself is a stove, he had written, if you know how to light it. The sun is the kindling, the winter is the flue. The plan was not just ditches. The ditches were only the first, most visible part. She read the passage again, her lips moving silently with the words. Lay a bed of river stone for drainage and heat retention. Upon this, place the conduits. Hollowed logs are best, their cellular structure a natural insulator. Then, the layers of life. Straw for air pockets. Manure for its slow, steady heat of decomposition. Finally, cap it with the excavated earth, packed tight. A living, breathing artery of mild warmth, a bulwark against the killing cold. It will not make the winter warm. It will make the winter survivable. The next morning she was not digging. She was at the creek with a wheelbarrow, hauling smooth, rounded stones, each one the size of a loaf of bread. The labor was different but no less grueling. She made a dozen trips, her muscles screaming, her pile of stones growing slowly by the trench. Mrs. Gable came by in the afternoon, her buggy laden with a basket. She was a round, soft woman whose kindness was a persistent, smothering force. "Ilara, dear child," she said, her brow furrowed with concern as she watched Ilara heave a stone from the barrow. "Silas Blackwood told me what you were doing. I brought you a chicken pie. You must eat. This is too much for you." "I'm strong enough," Ilara said, wiping her hands on her trousers. "But it's madness, dear. Digging ditches in the heat. It's no way to mourn. Your parents, God rest their souls, would want you to rest, to let the community help you." She placed the pie on the porch railing. "Let us help you stack your wood. Let us help you mend your fences." "My wood is stacked," Ilara said, gesturing to the neat cord of pine and aspen against the far side of the cabin, stacked higher than her head. "The fences are sound." Mrs. Gable's eyes followed her gesture. The woodpile was indeed immense, a testament to months of work. She seemed at a loss. "But the ditches, what are they for?" "They're for winter," Ilara said. It was all the explanation she had. Mrs. Gable patted her arm, her touch soft and pitying. "The grief has a hold of you, child. You let me know when you're ready to let it go." She left the pie and retreated to her buggy, her expression confirming to the valley that the poor Hayes girl had truly lost her senses. Ilara ate the pie for dinner, sharing scraps of crust with Boro. It was good. She was grateful for the kindness, but she did not need the pity. She had the journal. She had the plan. Weeks turned August into September. The air grew a crystalline edge. The aspen groves on the high slopes turned from green to shimmering gold. Ilara had finished the main trench. She had laid the bed of stones, a painstaking process of fitting them together to create a stable, porous base. Now she was felling dead lodgepole pines from the woods behind her cabin, sawing them into 10-foot lengths. She spent 2 full days with an auger and chisel, hollowing them out, creating crude but effective pipes. It was slow, frustrating work. Splinters embedded themselves in her palms. Her shoulders ached with a fire that never quite went out. One afternoon, a young man she recognized as Leo, one of Jedediah Thorne's hired hands, rode up the track. Thorne owned the largest ranch in the valley, a sprawling property of irrigated fields and prize-winning bulls. Leo was different from the others. He was quiet, and his eyes were observant. He didn't stop at a distance like Blackwood or bustle in with pity like Mrs. Gable. He dismounted and walked over, leading his horse. Burro watched him, but did not growl. "That's hard work," Leo said, nodding at the hollowed log she was struggling to roll into position. Ilara just grunted in agreement. "I've seen Roman aqueducts built with logs like that," he said, "in a book." Ilara stopped, surprised. She looked at him for the first time. He was young, maybe a few years older than her, with kind eyes and work-roughened hands. "My grandfather called it a hypocaust," she said, the word feeling strange and foreign on her tongue. "To heat the floors of a villa," Leo said, his eyes lighting up with recognition. "But you're not building a villa." His gaze traveled the length of the trench, from the well to the barn to the house. He saw the stones. He saw the hollow logs. He didn't see madness. He saw a system. "You're moving heat." Ilara stared at him. In 2 months of mockery and pity, he was the first person who had looked at her work and seen not a hole, but an idea. "Yes," she said. "What's it for?" he asked, his curiosity genuine. "For the deep freeze," she said, "after the false thaw." He nodded slowly, his eyes on the distant snow-capped peaks. Everyone knew of the false thaw. It was a cruel trick the high plains weather played every few years, a week of warm, spring-like weather in January that melted the snow and saturated the ground, followed by a sudden, brutal plunge in temperature that turned the entire valley into a solid block of ice. It killed livestock, froze wells, and broke the spirits of even the toughest ranchers. "You think one's coming this year?" he said. It wasn't a question. "The journal says so," she said. "The angle of the sun, the way the aspens lost their leaves, the migration patterns, it's all there." He looked from her to the massive log. "You need help with that." "I can manage." "I know," he said with a small smile, "but it would be faster with 2. He stayed for 2 hours. Together they rolled the heavy, hollowed logs into the trench, laying them end to end on the bed of stones. The work was still hard, but it was no longer solitary. When they were done, he drank from her canteen, his presence a quiet comfort in the vast, lonely landscape. He didn't ask any more questions. He just seemed to understand. Before he left, he looked at the growing piles of straw and the compost heap behind the barn. "You're going to fill the rest of the trench with that?" "Yes." "They're going to say you're planting a garden in October," he said, but he was smiling. "Let them," Ilara replied. And they did. As she spent the next weeks filling the trenches with the strange layers prescribed by the journal, straw, then a thick layer of manure from the barn, then more straw, the valley's opinion of her solidified from concerned pity to outright mockery. Jedediah Thorne rode by himself one day, his expensive saddle and polished boots a stark contrast to Ilara's work-stained clothes. "This is the most ridiculous thing I have ever seen," he announced, his voice carrying an aristocratic disdain. "You've made your property an eyesore and a laughingstock, filling ditches with manure. What do you expect to grow, nonsense?" Ilara didn't answer. She just kept pitching forkfuls of straw into the trench. Her silence was more infuriating to him than any argument. He rode off in a cloud of indignation. By mid-October, the work was done. The trenches were filled, capped with a thick layer of soil that formed long, raised berms, like burial mounds, connecting her small cluster of buildings. The earth was still raw, but she had seeded it with a hardy winter grass. To an outsider, it looked as if she had spent her entire summer and autumn creating a lumpy, uneven yard. She had done it. Every muscle in her body was a geography of pain, but she had followed the journal to the last detail. She spent the last weeks of autumn in more conventional pursuits, checking the seals on her windows, canning the last of her garden's produce, and ensuring the barn was draft-proof. Leo came by a few more times, always with a quiet offer of help to lift something heavy or fix a stubborn hinge. They spoke little, but a bond of mutual respect was forming, a silent acknowledgement of the coming test. The first snows came in November, a gentle dusting that turned the valley white and clean. The skeptics felt vindicated. Ilara's strange berms were just soft lumps under the blanket of snow, indistinguishable from any other drift. The winter settled in, cold and deep, but no more severe than any other. Christmas passed quietly. The valley hunkered down into the familiar rhythms of survival. Ilara's life was quiet and contained. She tended her small flock of chickens, her milk cow, and spent the long evenings reading by the fire, Boro asleep at her feet. The berms were forgotten. Then, in the second week of January, it came, the false thaw. A warm Chinook wind blew down from the mountains, and for 5 days, the temperature climbed above freezing. The snow melted into a slushy, muddy mess. The ground, which had been frozen a foot deep, thawed on the surface, becoming a saturated sponge. Silas Blackwood passed her property again, pulling a calf out of a mud bog. He saw her yard, a sea of mud with its strange, lumpy ridges, and shook his head. "All that work," he yelled over the wind. "Washed away in a week. Should have just stacked wood, girl." Ilara watched the water. She saw that it wasn't pooling on the berms. The loose, layered soil was absorbing it, and the stone beds deep below were channeling the excess away. Her yard was muddy, but it wasn't a swamp. She said nothing. She just watched the sky. On the 6th day, the wind died. An eerie, absolute stillness fell over the valley. The air grew heavy, and the sky turned the color of slate. Boro, who had been enjoying the thaw by sunning himself on the porch, came to the door and whined, a low, anxious sound. Ilara let him in. She checked the animals in the barn one last time, giving them extra feed and fresh water. She banked the fire in her stove high. The journal had described this exact stillness. The breath before the blow, her grandfather had written. The temperature drop began at dusk. It was not a gradual cooling, it was a plummet. From 40 degrees to 20 in the first hour. By midnight, it was 0. The wind returned, not the warm Chinook, but a razor-edged gale from the north, carrying ice pellets that scoured the cabin walls. The world outside her window disappeared into a howling vortex of white. For 2 days, the blizzard raged. Ilara did not leave the cabin. She had enough food, water, and wood to last a month. She listened to the storm trying to tear her small home apart and felt a profound sense of calm. She had prepared. On the morning of the 3rd day, the wind stopped. The silence was as shocking as the noise had been. Ilara pulled on her heaviest coat and opened the door. The world was remade in ice and snow. A thick, glittering crust coated every surface. The snow was drifted 5 feet high against the barn. But something was different. From the long, raised berms in her yard, a faint, almost invisible vapor was rising, like the breath of a sleeping giant. She took a step out onto her porch. The air was so cold it felt like a physical blow, a searing pain in her lungs. The thermometer by the door read 22 degrees below 0. She made her way toward the barn. The snow over the berms was different. It was still deep, but it was softer, less compacted. The ground beneath was not frozen solid. It had a slight give to it. She could walk the path she had built, a clear route from her cabin to her livestock. When she reached the barn, she found the door was not frozen shut. Inside, the air was cold, but not lethally so. The cow and chickens were huddled, but they were alive. The water in their trough, which was situated against the wall where a trench ran alongside the foundation, had a thin layer of ice on top, but was not a solid block. The latent heat, seeping through the stone foundation from the earth below, was making a small but life-saving difference. Her wellhead was the true test. It stood in the open, exposed to the full fury of the storm. It should have been a monument of solid ice, but the trench ran right up to its base, circling it. The ground around it was steaming. The pump handle was coated in ice, but when she put her weight on it, it moved. With a groan of protest, it brought up clear, liquid water. Not warm, but not frozen. She stood there for a long moment, the steam from the well and the berms mingling with her own breath in the crystalline air. It had worked. All the sweat, all the mockery, all the lonely, back-breaking labor. It had worked. It was 2 more days before anyone could move through the drifts. The first to come was Silas Blackwood. He didn't ride. He floundered through the snow on foot, his face a mask of desperation and exhaustion. He stopped 50 feet from her cabin, his jaw slack. He was staring at the steam rising from the ground. He was staring at the path she had shoveled with relative ease between her buildings. He was staring at the liquid water she was pouring into a bucket from her well. His own well was frozen solid. His pipes had burst. He had spent the last day and a half trying to chop through 6 inches of ice in his stock tank with an axe, a futile, energy-sapping effort. He had already lost a dozen cattle. He trudged forward, his pride stripped away by the brutal cold. Boro watched him approach but did not make a sound. "My well," Blackwood started, his voice cracking. "It's frozen. The stock tanks are solid. I'm losing them, girl. I'm losing everything." Ilara looked at his chapped, weather-beaten face, the despair in his eyes. She saw no triumph, felt no satisfaction in his defeat. She simply saw a neighbor in need. "The barn is warm enough," she said. "Bring the ones you can. The south side is warmest." He stared at her, uncomprehending for a moment. He had come to beg for water, perhaps to ask how her well had survived. He had not expected an offer of shelter. "But," I said. "I know what you said," she interrupted, her voice gentle. "It doesn't matter now. Go. Get your animals." He went. An hour later he returned, leading a string of his strongest remaining cattle through the deep snow. Leo was with him, his face grim but determined. He had come to help Blackwood and had seen the same impossible miracle at Ilara's homestead. He met Ilara's eyes and gave a slow, respectful nod. It had worked. They spent the rest of the day in a blur of brutal, life-saving labor. They cleared a path to her barn and herded Blackwood's shivering cattle inside. The small structure was crowded and loud, but it was alive. The collective body heat of the animals, combined with the subtle warmth seeping from the ground through the foundation, created a pocket of survivability in the frozen world. By evening, others began to arrive. Mrs. Gable, her face streaked with frozen tears, was brought on a makeshift sled by her husband. Their chickens had all frozen to death. Their pipes were shattered. They had been burning furniture to stay warm. Ilara took her inside, sat her by the stove, and gave her a hot cup of broth. The last to arrive was Jedediah Thorne. He was a diminished figure, his expensive coat torn, his arrogance frozen out of him. He had lost nearly half his prize-winning herd. His vast modern operation, with its electric pumps and heated water lines, had failed completely when the power lines went down and the pipes froze and burst. His wealth had been no defense against the fundamental power of the cold. He stood in Ilara's yard, looking at the steaming berms and the functional well. He looked at the barn, now a noisy ark filled with his neighbor's livestock. He came to her cabin, his hat in his hands. Leo and Silas Blackwood were there, warming themselves by the stove. Thorne did not look at them. He looked at Ilara. "I was wrong," he said. The words seemed to cause him physical pain. "I have a few calves left, my best ones. They won't make it another night." "There's room in the barn," Ilara said simply. Thorne looked down at his hands. "I'll pay you, whatever you ask." "Payment is a warm barn for your animals," she said. "Go get them." For a week, Ilara's homestead was a refugee camp. The cabin was crowded with people, the barn with animals. There was a sense of shared purpose, of community forged in the crucible of crisis. Ilara, who had been an outcast, was now the quiet center of it all. She shared her food, her water, her warmth, without a word of reproach for past insults. She simply did what needed to be done. One evening, Silas Blackwood sat at her table, staring into the fire. "My grandfather used to talk about winters like this," he said softly. "The winter of '88. Said it wiped out half the herds in the territory. They learned then, built their barns different, dug their wells deeper. We forgot. We got comfortable. We thought our new ways were better." He looked at Ilara, his eyes full of a new, profound respect. "Your grandfather didn't forget, and you listened." When the cold finally broke and the long thaw began, the valley was a wreck. Dozens of homes were damaged, hundreds of livestock were dead. But the people were alive. The core of their herds, sheltered in Ilara's barn, had survived. The rebuilding began that spring, but it was different. When the ground was soft enough to work, the first thing they did was not repair their fences or reseed their fields. They started digging. Silas Blackwood was the first. He came to Ilara not with a dismissive question, but with a humble request. "Will you show me?" he asked. "The journal, the way it's done." Ilara brought out her grandfather's book. Soon, her table was the center of the valley's planning. With Leo at her side, translating the complex engineering principles into practical language the ranchers could understand, she shared the knowledge. He helped her redraw the diagrams on large sheets of paper, explaining the importance of the stone bed, the precise angle of the conduits, the necessary composition of the insulation layers. That summer, the sound of shovels scraping earth was heard all over the valley. Men who had mocked her now sweated under the August sun, digging their own trenches, following the plans she had provided. Jedediah Thorne, true to his word, had a wagon load of the finest riverstone and cured lumber delivered to every homestead that was digging, his contribution a silent, public apology. The strange, lumpy berms began to appear across the landscape, connecting homes and barns, a shared architecture of survival. They called them Ilara's ditches. Years passed. The valley thrived. The ditches, now covered in thick grass, became a natural part of the landscape, their gentle rises and falls a testament to a lesson learned the hard way. The community was closer, bound by the memory of the Great Freeze and the shared knowledge that had saved them. Ilara and Leo married the following spring. Their home remained the heart of the valley. They had children who grew up playing on the berms, understanding them not as strange lumps, but as veins of life that kept their world safe. Boro grew old. His muzzle turned white. His steps became slow and deliberate. He spent most of his days sleeping by the fire, his dreams filled with the phantom scent of summer dust and the rhythmic sound of a shovel. One autumn evening, in his 17th year, he laid his head in Ilara's lap as she sat by the hearth. He gave a deep, contented sigh, a sound she had heard 1,000 times. His breathing slowed, softened, and then, peacefully, stopped. Ilara sat with him for a long time, her hand resting on his still, warm flank. Leo came and sat beside her, placing a hand on her shoulder. They buried him the next morning on the small hill behind the cabin, beneath a young aspen tree, a spot overlooking the homestead he had so faithfully watched over. There was no stone, just the tree that would mark his place. The grief was a quiet, heavy stone in her heart, a marker of time's relentless passage. Ilara grew into the valley's matriarch. Her hair turned the color of winter snow, but her eyes remained clear and intelligent. She added her own observations to her grandfather's journal, noting the subtle changes in the seasons, improving upon the designs, ensuring the knowledge would not be forgotten again. She taught the children, showing them how to read the sky, how to listen to the wind, how to understand the deep, slow pulse of the earth. In her 82nd year, after a long and peaceful life, Elara passed away in her own bed, surrounded by her children and grandchildren. The entire valley mourned. They buried her on the hill beside the aspen tree that marked Boro's grave. They debated for a long time about what to put on her gravestone. The mayor suggested a long epitaph, full of praise for her wisdom and generosity. Jedediah Thorne's grandson, now a respected community leader, wanted to commission a grand monument. It was Silas Blackwood's great-grandson, a young man with his ancestors' practical nature, who settled it. He remembered the stories his grandfather had told him, the simple, powerful truth of what she had done. The stone they erected was a simple piece of local granite. The inscription was short. It read, "Elara Hayes. She dug the ditches. She kept us warm." From the hill, one could see the entire valley laid out below. The network of grassy berms was everywhere, a web of life woven into the very fabric of the land. They rose and fell with the contours of the earth, a permanent, living monument to the quiet orphan girl who, armed with a shovel, an old book, and a stubborn belief in a forgotten idea, had taught them how to survive the winter. The ditches stood, a testament not to a single act, but to a legacy of warmth, wisdom, and the enduring strength of a plan.